Hi, everyone. This is Nimmer Laveau. I'm very excited to bring onto the platform now Diana Rachel, author of Urban Magick.
Hi, everyone. I'm Diana Rachel. I am the author of Urban Magick, A Guide for the City Witch, which was just released last March, and within a week, quarantine hit, so that's been fun. So I'm going to read a couple passages from the book, the intro and a little bit of the first chapter. And by all means, please ask your questions freely. I will get to them as I can. And so this will kind of give you a feel for what I'm working with in my perspective. If it helps as a way to frame it for most of you, this is very animistic. I am kind of somewhere between Gnostic and pantheistic myself. So to me, there's room for everything. But for some folks, this may seem a little unusual. So I'm going to start with the intro. When I began working with city spirits, I did not see myself as a priest. I saw myself as a person with a passionate interest in magic who wanted to get really good at it. Cities and their magical potential certainly called to me, but so did many things. The occult is a bursting closet with behemothic layers of interest. When you begin the study, you become the prize contestant standing in a wind tunnel trying to grasp the dollar bill equivalents of different topics. Even now, 20 years later, putting together a coherent narrative for other urban magical people feels like flailing in the tunnel. I had too many interests within the topic to settle for one. Becoming something specific, especially something city-related, snuck up on me. I wasn't looking to engage the city spirit when I moved to Minneapolis. After a divorce, I had to move to the nearest big city because the city had the jobs. With what was going on in my life at the time, mainly being broke and in my late 20s, I invested most of my study into figuring out why some spells worked and others didn't. I could feel the city spirit of Minneapolis watching, but paid little mind. I was too busy working magic like the rent was due tomorrow, because usually it was. About the time of my move, Llewellyn published Urban Primitive. This was the first time I saw any acknowledgement of the intelligence I felt hovering over me. It read to me like a palliative for nature workers living in cities. The premise hinged on someone stuck in the city and negotiating the necessity of a job while feeling that call to a pristine, idealized nature. I winced a little bit at the idea without fully knowing why, but I kept reading. I already knew that I rarely aligned fully with other people's magical perspectives. I found it valuable, even if I disagreed with some of it on a subterranean level. For me, city life was medicine for too many years in places of controlling isolation. Knowing this about myself, I took much of what Caldera and Schwartzstein presented into my personal practice and reframed it for someone who needed life in a large city. Not long after moving into my new urban apartment, an old college friend came to visit. During this time, she introduced me to a hipster obsessed with the architecture and urban design of Minneapolis. By the end of our first date, so to speak, I recognized him, the priest of the city of Minneapolis. As an atheist with a degree of contempt for woo folk like me, he probably still has no idea. For about 2 years, he and I went on weekly outings, always centered on exploring some aspect of the city. Once we walked the labyrinthine skyways. Another time we watched clouds obscure the city skyline. Yet another time we explored a lock station on the Mississippi River. Every adventure tapped me into some part of the city that he already instinctively knew. While he would never admit it, he seemed pulled along by some intuitive call to bring me to these oft-obscure places. I became aware of the magic of Minneapolis and St. Paul and felt its untapped potential on a visceral level. The place had more magic to work with than I could possibly conceive even now. City spirits have their own hierarchies, and those of us that it chooses for priests usually know nothing about the specifics of that hierarchy. Most of the time, we don't even know who the other priests are. I suspect Minneapolis already knew when I arrived that some other city had already claimed me, and so it supplied me a teacher for the work I would do later in life. I became expert at finding hidden opportunities, free things to do, and mysterious skyway corners visited by maybe 50 people a day. It didn't have many needs of me. It got those met by someone else. It just wanted to show me things that other people might not notice, and it often asked me to think about different ways to tap into magic of what it showed me. Without knowing, I trained as a city priest, and at the same time, my development as a witch continued unabated. This usually gentle guidance from the city spirit of Minneapolis had the long-term effect of unbinding me from religious dogma, even pagan religious dogma. As I became progressively untethered from the religious trappings of the type of witchcraft I trained in, the recognition of me as a priest by spirits and spiritual people lingered and strengthened. I am here to help. I am here to deliver messages that need hearing. I am here to listen. The other particulars, like picking a religion or some god to worship, aren't important in city work. It's proven a difficult task to organize and align what I learned with what my intuition told me others needed to know into something as coherent and systemic as a book. While this work has broken me out of a great deal of calcified thinking, such as nature only existing outside of human-made spheres, I have had to overcome several internalized bugaboos. I believe the spirit / source or whatever it is that drives these things needed me to see for myself that without cities, many things we enjoy and most things we rely on wouldn't exist. Along the way, I was given the privilege of guidance from a city spirit that wants very much to be seen. The mystery of civilization, what prompted humanity to create written language, to develop engineering, and to build communities with an intent beyond that of mere survival, is also the mystery of the city. None of these things could happen until humans built the first city. Only then, with that small relief from the burden of survival, could they feel the urge to create beyond that of procreation and sustenance. By attempting to point out the ways in which cities were born and the ways in which they are crafted now, I am hoping to show other magical people new spiritual discoveries hidden in between the lines of city streets and parkways. There are cycles, death and rebirth, devastation and miraculous healing, all contained in the microcosm of what we call city. So with that said, moving on to the basics of urban magic, and I'll cover that, and then I'm open to Q&A, or I can just do a quick overview of ways to practice, especially with things going on right now. Here we go. So chapter 1 is, what is urban magic? Urban magic has 3 aspects: working with the spirit of a given city, tapping the energy generated by a city for your own use, or using energy you generate to benefit the city spirit and your neighbors. Aside from believing in the metaphysical, urban magic has no religious framework, and its practice at this point is mostly through practitioners that work magic alone or with one partner. In some ways, it is a forgotten ancient practice, and in others, a version of magic for modern pioneers. If you happen to be Wiccan or Christian or Druid, for example, you can work with city magic while still honoring your tradition. If you happen to see yourself as aligned with nature, that doesn't preclude you from city magic. Nature lives in the city just as much as it does outside of it. Each city has its own energy and spirits. I have traveled enough to know that they differ greatly from one another, but they also exist and come about in similar ways. I would love to travel the world and write a grimoire based in every major city and be able to offer you a comprehensive book with a chapter for each city. However, at the time of this writing, such a thing is cost prohibitive. Also, I'm not sure my own lifespan would be long enough to gather all that data. My own style of magical working is deeply relational. I spend time with a city and work on that connection over years and decades. While living in a city helps, it is possible to forge friendships with cities you visit. Most city spirits will work with anyone sincere. Those who prefer formalized ritual have as much of a place with urban magic as those who perform magic from a place of spontaneous intuition. However, city priesthood is solely a calling that happens at the discretion of the specific city spirit. You can live in a city for 20 years and never sense a thing, and visit another city for a day and hear it say, "I want you." Suddenly, you may find yourself moving to the city that called when you had no plans for relocation. These callings move on tides far larger than human perception. When possible, I give examples from a broad range of cities, but my own experiences are limited to Europe and North America. Minneapolis trained me for the work I do in San Francisco, and San Francisco sought me out. Because of that, most of my examples come from these two cities. Until then, I will leave it to you, intrepid experimental magicians and city lovers, to use what I have here as a launching point for you to develop your own grimoires and guides. To guide you along the way, let's start with a broader introduction to the concepts behind urban magic. Starting with, what's a city? Legally, in the United States, a city is an incorporated geographic area where one governing body manages sanitation, power, roads, and education. Towns do not have legal incorporation, and citizens must determine for themselves how to manage their power, water, and road maintenance. Towns often incorporate into cities after a drastic increase in population. The magical definition of a city includes the legal definition. In addition, for urban magic, the following conditions must exist: an identity shared by the city's residents, Londoner, Parisian, New Yorker, Minneapolite, a steady multi-choice mass transit system, and at least one area where buildings exceed 10 floors. And I do want to pause and say that, again, this had to be edited in a certain way for absolutes. The only one I would consider even close to an absolute is that a city spirit has to have residents with a shared identity of some kind. Everything else is much more fluid and flexible depending on the spirit of the city. There's no doubt in my mind that by defining it, someone will find at least 10 exceptions, and this is good. There are just guidelines shaped from one personal practice. The only definition that has thus far proved a hard and fast rule is that first one. The area must have some shared identity, whether localized to the city like New York or regional like Chicago, to harbor a true city spirit. Does that mean someone living in a suburb or a rural area can't practice urban magic? No. But for those in rural areas, you will need to visit a city if you want to work with the city spirit. You don't need to live there, but you do need to be around city energy often enough to develop a relationship. Some city spirits are friendlier to tourist energy than others, and it's often a matter of having a sincere, respectful approach. So what do I need to know about cities? It helps to have an appreciation for urban design and architecture. Both affect human behavior and can solve or cause social problems while escaping our conscious awareness. Different urban designs can manipulate our moods, our thoughts, and even where we walk. Buildings can act as containers, roads as energy paths, gardens as power sources, and so on. If you understand the behavior and emotions these spaces are designed to stir, you can better calibrate your own magical work. So, do suburbs have city spirits? It depends. Sometimes a suburb may contain collective self-identification sufficient to form and feed a city spirit. Sometimes its dependence on the city as an energy inlet makes it part of a regional spirit. Even if a suburb has a shared identity, it may have less power than it would in an area that has a higher population density and a fully formed city spirit. While you can't work with the city spirit where one doesn't exist, smaller spirits and entities are everywhere. In rare cases, suburbs become cities as their population grows enough to become independent from the original city spirit. A particularly ambitious suburban magician might create a city spirit. While this would take enormous personal energy and feeding, it would make for a fascinating experiment in how far a created spirit's impact can spread over a specific geographic area. Kids, don't try this at home, and definitely not if you're new at this. So, what do I need to know about magic? City magic can include all spiritual paths, but at its root, it is a form of folk magic. In folk magic, you use what's around you. While people who practice specific traditions may try to emulate the tools of their ancestors, city magic embraces the new and the old equally. Even if the substance, plastic for example, didn't exist in the past, if it's available now, you can engage it for your magical workings. Urban magic does not require formal training, initiations, or elevations. You practice the magic by experiencing it, and when possible, by sharing your experiences with open minds. A city magician may well weave in material from other trainings and traditions. In the course of a month, a city magician may incorporate Kabbalah, traditional witchcraft, and chaos sigils, and that would be a slow month. The practice is strange, uncharted, and fluid, much like a day wandering your city can be. I suspect that city priests in Lagos, Cairo, New Delhi, or Beijing have an entirely different approach than mine, with very different toolkits. I truly hope to hear from some of them someday. So what is a city spirit? Since working with city spirit and urban energies is the focus of this book, it helps to know what one is and what one is not. A city spirit is not a genius loci. The genius loci is the intelligence inherent in the land of an area, including the land a city stands on. The city spirit manifests by forming an intelligence from the collective intelligence and energy generated from people living in a city. Major cities have both a genius loci, land spirit, and a city spirit, in addition to the several smaller spirits that can populate a landscape. So what are the goals of urban magic? Because urban magic does not follow a specific religious or ethical path, the goal of urban magic depends on the goals of the magic worker. Currently, the four most common are the civic path, the chaotic path, the hearth and home path, and the priesthood path. What urban magic path a person chooses may or may not align with any chosen or called religious path. For example, a person that venerates Pan in his pre-civilization aspect may experience some energetic conflict when working with the most visible measures of civilization. The civic path for urban magic engages city energy for social change. People who work this path petition the city spirit to solve social problems that happen in their cities. They may use their magical skills and relationships to reduce crime in their neighborhoods, to find homeless housing, or to sway political bodies to give money to certain common communal needs. People who practice druidry, reclaiming tradition witchcraft, or that subscribe to humanism may feel especially inclined to work the civic path of urban magic. The chaotic path is for those inclined to experiment with the unknown and even invent new deities and servitors just to see what happens. While chaos magicians often still perform workings for personal goals, they thrive off the wilder energies of the universe, and certain cities do generate mayhem. The chaotic path is the path of the mad scientist, and it is often chaos magicians who discover or invent new ways of working with urban magic. Chaos magicians have their own approach well in hand, so this text focuses on the other paths. The hearth and home path in other areas of magical practice might also be called the path of the hearth fire. This path consists of people who prioritize keeping their homes and families safe and provided for. They work within the city in much the same way they might anywhere else. While these magicians might venture to influence their neighborhood for some greater good, quieter summer night so a baby can sleep, or amicability with all the neighbors, they have little interest in any far-reaching results of their work. They prefer instead to benefit from the safety and peace they can build into their domestic routine. The priesthood path has the fewest travelers and is by far the most difficult to explain. Some, but not all, city spirits select one person or a few people to act as priests, assigning to certain magic workers the spiritual care of itself. These priests may or may not know one another. They may work in cooperation with each other or seemingly at random as the city spirit guides them. This avocation is often strange, even in the world of magic workers. Some city spirits require death and resurrection ceremonies. Others want their workers to heal wounds in the fabric of the city's psyche when deep violence has happened. Sometimes the city spirit wants help playing mostly harmless pranks on its inhabitants. Since the last publicly identified city priest disappeared when the Catholic Church overtook Rome, the city priesthood path has little in the way of a map for people on it. If the city spirits they serve have even bothered to inform them they've got the job. All causes and beings, whether their magical path is left, right, or center, have a place within a healthy city. Because city spirits function as living organisms, they require the same balance of light and shadow as human beings. Destruction, creation, and chaos keep organisms alive. So all this talk of spirits is fine, but what if I can't see, hear, or feel the energies? You do not need strong psychic talent to work magic. There are city priests who have no idea they even do it. If you happen to be one of those people who believes something is out there and that magic works, but have to take it on faith, you're far from alone. If you feel love for things ineffable, you still have a place at the table in the magical community. You may need to use some alternate methods to confirm that something is happening. For example, you can ask for specific signs when performing a working or meditation, feathers in your path, for instance, or even a literal billboard with a message for you. Over time, you'll get a conversation going with your city spirit over the channels you can perceive, and the lack of psychic sensitivity won't matter as much. So where does your city magic come from? The techniques laid out in this book are my personal practices, developed while working with the city spirits of Minneapolis and San Francisco unless otherwise credited. The modern practice of magical urbanism is new enough that I can freely admit I'm making things up. I try things out, see what works, and discard what doesn't. What I share here is what has worked for me. Techniques I discarded may work for you. City spirits have unique personalities, and so none of this can possibly work as one size fits all. If you're already working city magic, you are already making things up as you go along too. What works in London might just piss off New York. All we can do is make a note of what happens and, when possible, report our efforts to each other. So is urban magic anti-nature? Urban magic is not a practice where you look at nature as something pristine, virginal, and far away. Cities came to exist because nature can kill you. To a city spirit, Mother Nature and a genius loci are always right there watching everything you do. Beings that live in nature, including humans, find ways to adapt and survive those conditions. It's an aspect of evolution. While most animals evolved body parts to help them survive, humans adapted to conditions using the tools around them. City dwellers remain vulnerable to natural disasters, climate conditions, and weather. While architects and urban planners design buildings and streets intended to mitigate these concerns, Mother Nature has a mind of her own and more resources than any city. Cities are, to nature itself, just another ecosystem. Understanding that ecosystem is the key part of urban magic. So what cities are you talking about? This book has a strong bias towards the United States, especially in the Midwest, because this is where I learned my own urban magic. Because I can't account for experiences unknown to me, I encourage international readers to adjust these techniques and to share results via social media and blogging. For instance, the history and architecture of Sao Paulo, Brazil differs from that of Washington, D.C. And what you might do with a skyscraper during drought season may differ quite a bit from how you anchor your energy to a monolith in the D.C. Mall during a blizzard. Also, I realize not everyone can do some of what I recommend in the book physically or legally. It is always okay and good to develop your own workarounds, and I encourage you to share them. Ethics and philosophy. Ethics is considered by most a method used for determining right from wrong. From my perspective, it is more an area of thought to consider whom our actions affect and how. While I am not introducing a magical tradition so much as a magical mindset, I do feel obligated to acknowledge some ethical considerations. Chief among those concerns raised are those of environmental care, colonization, and civil disobedience. That any of these concerns can mix, match, and conflict, and that they all appear aplenty in urban settings is not a coincidence. City magic, by its nature, crosses many boundaries that magicians in the late 20th century were often encouraged to avoid, especially in the areas of politics, chaos, and mass manipulation. More people than ever before feel called to use all their abilities to shape their lives and their countries into places they want to live. Using magic in response to politics isn't new. Since time immemorial, it has been the way humanity takes power in the face of its own powerlessness. The reason that most people are advised to avoid attempting to influence political outcomes with magic is that their targets are too big. Trying to influence the outcome of a US presidential election is roughly on par with using magic to win the lottery. It might work, but there's a lot of competing energy for that. City magic can show you how political energies move. The smallest political systems are the most easily influenced, and that consists of neighborhood and city government. When casting something as simple as a good neighbor spell, you can see with immediacy how a seemingly benign intent, such as improving the neighborhood, can lead to unintended consequences, such as evictions and foreclosures. If civic urban magic is your path, it's important to be aware of consequences and accept the risks. Many see monkey's paw type consequences as the reason to refrain from moving around energies. My philosophy deems inaction worse than action, even in the face of failure. Every action, even something as trivial as, say, putting on a pair of socks, has consequences somewhere. Because magicians do not universally subscribe to one ethical practice and don't all come from a singular religious background, I won't advocate the correctness of any specific philosophy. The needs of Flint, Michigan are distinctly different from the needs of Moscow. Whatever ethical model works for you, please found it on introspection and thorough questioning. Before working any magic, pause and think carefully about everyone it might affect and in what way they might be affected. The more you shape a concrete result as a sign of success, the more you can manage the ethical fallout. In urban magic, even small workings have potential to affect large populations, no matter how well you lay the boundaries. Divination, meditation, and opening a conversation with city spirit all can form the foundations of this type of ethical work. So, focusing a little bit more, urban magic and the environment. People who place high spiritual value in healing and protecting the environment may have concerns about the overall safety and cleanliness of city magic. Some may worry about engaging with energy that is in some cases literally machine and fossil fueled because it might contribute further to the poisoning of natural resources. As much as I'd like to give a blanket answer that it doesn't, the reality is much more complex. A lot of what's considered common knowledge on these topics no longer applies. First, we must shift our perspectives on cities from resource consumers to resource conservers. After that, you also have to take the first law of thermodynamics into account. Energy can be neither created nor destroyed. Environmental cleanup is important, and the stuff we're cleaning up doesn't just go away. Even after we resolve the damage it does to the land, we have to figure out what to do with the substances that cause the damage. To inadequately break it down within the popular environmental slogan, much city magic involves reducing and reusing or repurposing, and yes, just a bit of recycling. But to act in that particular green triad, the bad stuff has to be present to be repurposed. The urban magic I recommend in this book should for the most part not add to the damage. I encourage you to work with what's already around you rather than adding non-organic material to the land. As in all things concerning environmental health, every action taken to benefit one aspect of the environment trades off with a negative effect somewhere else. While the industrial world has a long way to go, more municipalities recognize economic and public health benefits to green design. While very much a slow work in progress, many cities are slowly becoming places with smaller overall carbon footprints and less strain on the soil. All environmentalism comes back to preserving the longevity of animals and humans on the earth. We started by understanding not to poison ourselves. We have extended that care to animals. Now we are looking at how technology impacts the environment before we unleash it on the world. While the progress is frustrating and slow, when it comes to urban planning and technological innovation, there have been significant strides in reducing negative environmental impact. Urban magic may follow a similar path. So how magic affects the earth. When it comes to doing environmental harm while working magic, much of the concern remains the same as they do in any other situation. In the minds of many magic workers, deciding whether to cast or call spirits, the question of what are the possible consequences includes the impact on surrounding nature. Urban magicians must account for the supplies they use, where those supplies came from, and how to dispose of them. A petroleum-based paraffin candle pollutes just as much in a city as it does on a farm, although the smoke runoff has the potential to irritate more people in a city. Burying old spill materials that don't biodegrade might affect the groundwater, and so on. The more ways workers find to use and repurpose byproducts, the more they nurture the city itself. The accumulated effort reduces environmental strain. An extreme example is freegans, people who dumpster dive for food and other reusable items. Artists, often also magical people, may appropriate pieces of waste for their works. Drivers that build cars to run on renewable fuel take grease that restaurant owners might otherwise have to pay to have disposed of. In a society prosperous enough to generate so much waste, the waste itself provides opportunities. The waste still exists in places where people spread out more, but the cost benefit of finding that waste and using it dwindles in a rural environment as opposed to an urban one. Choosing to embrace the city on a magical level means a few things. First, that you recognize that there are non-biodegradable synthetic things that are part of our lives, and they are here to stay. Finding new and creative ways to work with them, adapting them to art, magic, and justice is really the only thing to be done with them until the day someone grows just the right bacteria to eat the non-biodegradable things without turning into termites for all. Second, the virtue lies in change over abstinence. While you can certainly refuse to engage with city life, and many do have good mental health-related reasons for doing so, embracing city magic on a personal and ethical level means getting involved. Third, you open yourself to experiment. Manufactured substances are not automatically without magical potential. Only pewter and lead fail completely to hold magical charges. And I have been informed since then that there are ways around that. One of the areas of greatest technological advancement at this time is in correcting environmental damage. These changes will definitely affect the way we work with the city. Until then, do your best and know that living in the city does not mean you are doing more harm to the earth. So the next part, and then I think that I want to pause because, well, it's actually the end of the chapter, but it talks about civil disobedience. And I did not know what was coming when I wrote this, but maybe on some level I did, given the timing. So the dark side of urban magic. Most magical people, especially pagans, talk about shadow work as a metaphor for recognizing our weaknesses and blind spots. For some reason, this discussion usually happens separately from exploration of ethics, even though our shadow sides are why we need those guidelines. In city magic, our shadow selves become visible quickly. The way we cordon off city neighborhoods by money and race shows us our prejudices, and that is energy that must be recognized and honored before we have any hope of redirecting it. Magic is disquieting at its most advanced. The most disturbing and unsettling discoveries will be about yourself. You have to make peace with your own ugly to work urban magic, because your innate responses will come out. Large cities have unpleasant things. Homelessness, drug addiction, casual emotional and physical violence, and mental illness all come into naked view. While these problems themselves may seem like the city's dark underbelly, the real darkness lives in how you respond when you see these unpleasant realities. You may find over time that your virtuous responses to these realities are a source of perpetuated evil. City spirits sometimes use panhandlers, those suffering perceptual illnesses, and even uncomfortable and weird interactions with neurotypical people to communicate. This often means that you must work to break through your own projections and prejudices to read the real situation. Sometimes the panhandler is just another grifter, making your parking lot experience a little more difficult. Sometimes it's a manifestation of spirit. Sometimes someone genuinely needs help. You won't be able to tell the difference until you move from a place of reacting to a place of responding to what presents itself. The most visible disquiet appears in mass transit. Taking transit gives you a chance to practice checking your filters. For instance, if you encounter someone with visible mental illness on the bus, observe yourself first. What are your gut reactions? What do you hear yourself think? Do you feel judgment, disgust, fear? What about pity? What does pity make you feel about yourself? Root out the why of every response. Look deep into your reactions. Some of these people are ill, some of the clean-cut ones are criminals, and some of the strange ones are non-human sentient spirits that have integrated into city life. Looking first at your own reactions reveals underlying attitudes that can block your spiritual perceptions. The dirt also covers you. The shadow of the city lies within our reactions just as much as it does in those who experience misfortune as a byproduct of city life. So I do need to add on colonization, appropriation, and your safety. Some reading this book have concerns for misappropriation. I can't promise this book is totally decolonized and appropriation-free. I am 50% colonizer descendant and 50% descendant of a non-colonizer who lucked into cultural normalization eventually. Even when I strive, there are simply things I cannot see because of my privilege. The rituals included come from my own private development. Anything borrowed that I don't specifically acknowledge is because it is so commonplace that it hasn't occurred to me to question its origin. There are several places in this book where I suggest activities that, while not illegal for the most part, might still put certain individuals at risk of violence, for no other reason than because of how they look or speak. I wish I could do more to protect you. If something isn't safe for you to do because of this, please speak up about it. City Magic is forever a work in progress, and that particular part of the progress is important work you will be doing for yourself. So there's a little bit on civil disobedience. Later chapters include rituals you may wish to perform in public. If you live in an area where the law has an arbitrary attitude about your right to freedom of assembly, you may end up breaking the law. In some cases, you may perform public rituals as acts of protest. Not all acts of civil disobedience are camera grabbers. Sit-ins and marchers grab cameras, but people painting crosswalk lines themselves, rather than waiting for the city to do it, also make a difference in the lives of others. Some of the most iconic public art came about as acts of civil disobedience. In a pinch, you can always claim what you're doing is performance art. Authorities never know what to do with performance artists. I do feel obligated to point out that you can also work city magic without breaking the law. But if you are coming to magical urbanism with that intent, your city spirit is probably going to have some interesting jobs for you. I only ask that if you decide to fight cultural entrenchment, you approach it with thought, strategy, and a plan for bail. Neither I nor my publisher can accept liability for your actions. If you have a love for cities and a love for magic, you are fully qualified to practice magical urbanism. You need only love the city in your own way. Some of you may love the glamour of nightlife and the creative spirit rising from arts and culture, or from the underground of raucous weirdos every city harbors somewhere. Some of you may want to use your skills to effect powerful social changes. Some of you may prefer a quiet approach, working with spirit from home. Some of you may still not see yourselves in this text and are off doing your own thing with your city spirit. That thing is also urban magic. You will let us see you when you feel ready. Welcome to the city, magical people. There's room for you. So that's kind of what I have there. And so if anyone has any questions, it is a very off the beaten path. And I know the stuff that I wrote towards the end was written way before this year, and I'm a little disturbed myself at how very applicable it is right now. But I did write this book with an understanding that a lot of the spells and a lot of the approaches in there are kind of intended as a subvert guide to rethinking and rewriting power structures. It can be small stuff, but it doesn't have to be small stuff. So does anyone have any questions?
It'll just take them a second to send them through.
Okay.
But I found this actually very fascinating. I had not, it makes sense once you start talking about it. You're like, oh yeah, these great cities have great powers and spirits, etc. So very fascinating. Let's just see if anybody has any questions passing through.
Okay. One of the things that I want to kind of point out, and I think especially because right now everything going on in the world is so overwhelming, and I know a lot of Wiccans kind of understand the microcosm, macrocosm theory, where you have the small thing that affects the greater thing. And a lot of us get very swept up in the macrocosm and feeling our own insignificance. But cities are a good example of a microcosm, and it's something that I've had to keep telling people is, yeah, we get caught up in these national elections, and every 4 years, Facebook turns into a living hell because of all the politics. But it's the local elections, it is the local practices, it is the local magic. Not only will it make the biggest and most immediate and perceivable difference in your life, which will be better for you psychologically, because, hey, you actually see something you do mattering, but it also can kind of build a protection against that larger stuff out there. It is the very reason cities exist. Is it started as, holy crap, nature is huge and it's going to kill us. Let's try to slow that down. And now it's okay, there are these gigantic entities, but we can still build our boundaries. Not necessarily build city walls. And for those that do read the book, there's a lot of things about city walls and its connection to poverty that are anchored in our history. So hi, Lee. Lee, hi, thank you. My book is actually out and available right now on Amazon. So you can get it on Amazon, or I encourage you to talk to your favorite indie bookseller and ask them to order it, either from their preferred distributor or directly from Llewellyn Publishing. Or if you have no patience whatsoever, it is definitely available in digital right now. So yes, thank you. So yeah, that's kind of, I have a lot of thoughts and a lot of passion about this topic, and I know my current situation has changed. Is literally last week I just moved from San Francisco to Kalamazoo, Michigan, because my life in San Francisco just changed drastically in the past year. So the book came out and boom, everything else hit. And so now I'm just kind of recalibrating to being an itinerant city priestess, and I'm actually kind of excited to be living here because Kalamazoo it definitely has its own city spirit and it definitely has some issues, but I'm also within range of 4 major cities that I can learn from. And I had my first visit to Detroit since 1996, this last February when I went to convocation, and it is an example of what I'm talking about. Is these people may not be conscious that they're working urban magic, but just that little bit of rebellion has rebuilt the city. Unfortunately, now it's getting right up to the edge of gentrification, but basically the people that were part of Detroit that remembered their city spirit, remembered their own spirit, have done some truly innovative, amazing stuff and have turned it back into somewhere that is just livable and really impressive to be in. So yeah. If anyone else has any other questions, or I know that some people will ask me spirit work questions as well, or I want to do this with my city, or I'm concerned about nature magic, and how this works. And I do walk through exercises for connecting to the natural energies in synthetic objects, which I think really helps. So a lot of people started with the 5 element, where it's earth, air, fire, water, and spirit. And so I will have people do is I will point to a book or a chair and say, okay, tell me about the components. Tell me about where the elements are in this, because they're there. If you're familiar with anything from Agrippa's theories, basically everything in the material plane is something that is meeting from the 5 other planes and is just what we perceive as material according to that. And the breakdown makes it a lot easier to call out the specific elemental energies, which is a reminder of oh yeah, unless it's literally from outer space, it comes from nature as we know it. And if it's from outer space, it's just nature that we don't know.
There is a question that's come up that says, have you found difficulty working with different cities?
Yes. And in my case, sometimes it's a little personal. But yeah, there are some cities that are more resistant to others, and I will tell you, San Francisco that stuff should have come with a helmet. Cities with more disparity tend to be more difficult to work with the exception of New York, just because it is so firmly established in its own identity. Cities that have more fluid identities, more changing populations, and cities going through a lot more displacement, usually because of gentrification, are more difficult to work with because their personalities are literally changing by the minute. So that can make it a lot more difficult. The other challenge, and this is something that in San Francisco, one of the biggest problems that I had that I wasn't even aware of all the time, is the genius loci, the land spirit, did not get along with the city spirit. And that can be a huge problem, especially since the genius loci basically is in charge of all the earthquakes. But part of the problem is that because of severe droughts over the years, people just kind of paved over their lawns all over the place. And so literally the land spirit couldn't breathe. It's gotten to the point where there are several places where trees are basically sort of forgetting how to root because everything got paved over, so they don't have a way of getting to the groundwater. They don't have a way of getting to the underground rivers that have been built over in San Francisco. And so it's essentially a suffocating, it's essentially basically suffocating the land spirit and creating this almost constant state of some kind of unrest. So that could be difficult. Also, sometimes, you know, with me, things get personal. I grew up in Chicago area. I left Chicago area without saying goodbye. I just had to be exposed to Chicago recently to move to Kalamazoo, and Chicago is still pouting at me. But I have no idea what it's like for the priests there. My understanding is that the development there has been, you know, aside from a cheerful history of corruption, it's pretty much developing pretty well, as far as I know, aside from, you know, the usual standard urban problems. So yes, thank you, Lily. Thank you. I would love to come to the Detroit Conjure Festival because I am passionately in love with all things hoodoo and conjure. So it speaks to my animistic, wicked little heart. So yeah, and I know with urban magic, and this is something I say, and this may offend some people, so I'm just going to warn you, but I feel like a lot of pagan traditions kind of Madonna whore nature. And it's this thing, and it came from this 19th century ideal where the Industrial Revolution was just dirty. It was dirty ethically, it was dirty practically, it was really polluting for the environment. And it turned into this thing where even getting to pristine nature, to like the clean mountain air, just about anybody would fantasize about it, but the only people really able to get there were the wealthy. And before the Industrial Revolution, nature was nature. If there was a mouse in your house, that was still nature. If there was a dandelion poking up through the ground, that was nature. But after the Industrial Revolution, when basically the whole world kind of got oil slicked or coal slicked or something, it turned into this concept where nature has to be this perfect ideal, you know, not quite like, I hate to use the alignment, but like nature kind of got held up to a Barbie doll standard to be considered nature. And yet it doesn't mean that your houseplants or the grass you have in your lawn or the rocks you use for your pavement are any less natural. They are still part of nature. They still originated there. They still have, you know, I'm an animist, so to me, they still have a life and an intelligence in them that deserves to be acknowledged. And getting away from the looking at nature as a thing to escape to the understanding that nature is ultimately inescapable is nowadays a fairly drastic shift in mindset. You know, I could be living in a beautiful condo in a 50-story building, and if a tornado wants at me, it's going to get at me. You know, nature is inescapable, and the city is not separate from nature. It is just as vulnerable and just as culpable. And yeah, there are nature spirits that choose to live in cities in part because of that reality, that it's everywhere. I also do a lot of work with North American Fae, and the Winter Fae consider themselves urban. They've been very vocal to me about that. And they want to pass along that they're trying to keep us from getting our butts killed because they see us as a nature to preserve. So it's very, very different from what we might have been taught to expect. So yeah, I tend to ramble, so I'll warn you. So don't wait for me to finish because I will just go down some really freaking weird pathways when left unattended. Okay, no more questions?
Nope, I think that's it.
Okay. All right, and thank you everyone for bearing with the technical hiccup. It took me a little way to find my way around. Took me a little time to find my way around. Is it okay if I plug a couple things?
Please do.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and just like, I have a lot of different things going on, and I do see I do see my website up there. I'm going to add a list of things. Tomorrow, for those that are interested, I am doing a Q&A at Elements of Kalamazoo, and I will be reading a reader there shortly. I also work with Wicked Grounds in San Francisco, which has a Magic 101 series that is not religiously based. And I run a show with my business partner, Nikki Jobin, on Random Tuesdays called Left Unsupervised, which is misbehaving. It is an after hours put the kids to bed kind of show where we talk about people being wrong on the internet a lot. But we also talk about magic and how we practice it, especially since we are both at this point seasoned spirit workers. And we talk about, how magic affects our daily lives and how we think about things. I also do have a book coming out hopefully next year. The tentative title is Counter Magic and Hex Twisting, which is all about curse breakings, creative reversals, and basically ways to handle people pestering you their own butts. So there is a wall of stuff there. Sorry about that. Including an urban magic group on Facebook if you would like to join to talk about and share your own ideas. And lots of places you can find me. So thank you so much for having me. This has been fun. I've been popping in and out on the other authors, and this is such a cool event.
Thank you, Diana. It's been wonderful to hear from you. I'm super fascinated, and I'm already sending your book off to different friends who maybe weren't here. I'm like, oh, you guys are going to want this. So absolutely. Awesome. Have a wonderful afternoon.
You too. Thank you for having me.